Okay, so welcome everybody to our LERA session on gender and pay. Just to give you a sense of the rules. So this is a 3-paper session. So each paper will have 40 minutes with 22 minutes for the paper presenter, 10 minutes for the discussant, and 8 minutes for Q&A from the audience. So I'll ask the audience to wait until the end to ask questions. You can either raise your hand or I guess unmute yourself. It's a small session, so I think we can run it easily. So our first paper will be by Yukiko Asai on the cost of employment and flexible labor demand with evidence from Japan, and her discussant is going to be Joseph Marchand from the University of Alberta. So Yukiko, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Claudia, for a nice introduction. And good morning and Happy New Year, everybody. I'm Yuki from Chicago and happy to see you all here. My paper title is Cost of Employment and Flexible Labor Demand. Okay, so since we only have 22 minutes for presentation, I'm going to summarize my result first, just in case I did some overtime. So I'm going to examine the effect on workers from labor demand response to the cost of mandated maternity and parental leave reforms. I'm going to focus on a particular aspect of leave policies, which is social insurance contribution paid by firms during leave. So in most countries, the unemployment insurance covers the income replacement during leave for workers. So it seems that parental leave is not very costly for firms. However, in the country I'm studying, firms still had to pay for the workers' social insurance payment during leave, which amount to 13% of workers' monthly earnings. So since some firms hire substitute workers to cover the workers on leave, this extra cost of employment was a burden for the firm. And what's worse is that it mostly applies for female workers in childbearing age, because that's the people who take leave. So it may be a disincentive for firms to hire women, and it was also an incentive for firms to move women to non-permanent positions, since firms are not obligated to pay social insurance for non-permanent workers. So what I'm going to do is here, a series of reforms occurring in 2000, 2001, and 2014 gradually reduce these costs to zero. So I'm going to use this reform as a quasi-experimental variation. And I'm going to look at the two outcomes here, starting wages and the probability on permanent contract. And I give you a quick recap of result here. I found that $1,000 decrease in cost of employment increased starting pay by 3.3% and increased the probability of starting on the permanent contract by 2.5% for women in childbearing age. I also found that the effect was larger for large firms. So I start from the theoretical framework. So theoretically, workers' social insurance payment during leave may increase the cost of employment, so that an increase in social insurance payment may decrease wages or employment or decrease both. And since family leave is mostly taken by women, women's labor demand is affected by the cost from social insurance, but men's labor demand would not be affected. Another prediction is here. It's that since there's no obligation for firms to pay the social insurance for non-permanent workers, a firm may move workers who needs higher insurance cost into non-permanent contract. And there are some evidence by Carrington et al. 2002 shows that firms move workers with higher employment costs into part-time and seasonal positions. So I predict that the cost of employment will decrease the probability of having a permanent contract. So in this study, I'm going to investigate whether younger women may be paid less and may be less likely to be hired on a permanent contract due to the higher cost of employment. Okay, so here is a quick review of previous studies. There are many studies examine the effect of introduction or expansion of insurance premium on employment and wages. And most studies find that an increase in the insurance cost decrease employment and wages, but the effects are mostly small. And more recent study is here, study on the direct effect of maternity and parental leave for employers. And these studies are focusing on the effect of worker absence. And these studies show mostly small effects, but still effect is ambiguous. And these studies look at the effect of worker absence due to leave and effect on farm survival, negative or no effect. And also Garan in 2019 finds no change in hiring in response to the cost increase. So theoretically, still very ambiguous topic. What is different between previous studies and my study is that I focus on an experiment that reduced social insurance cost. Compared to other study, this is measurable cost for employers than cost from worker absence. Another thing I do is, since the country I study has a universal health insurance program, I'm able to separate effects of changes in cost from endogenous responses by workers and farms. Since there's only one type of insurance, we do not need to worry about workers and farms switching health insurance program in response to the cost. And third, in the country I'm studying, the contingent workforce is used alongside permanent workers. So it's easier to observe farms moving workers from permanent to temporary position within farms. All right, let me go into a little bit more detail. So the country I focus is in Japan. All citizens are covered by universal health insurance and pension insurance system. So the red line is pension insurance. It is around 17% of income. And blue line here is health insurance, which is around 9%. And these rates changed slightly over time. Total insurance contribution is about 26% of workers' monthly earning. And just like many other countries, farms and workers share the cost. So employers are responsible for half the health and pension insurance cost for each employee, which is around 13% of workers' employee earnings. And let me explain the government reforms here. So to reduce the burden of farms with workers on maternity and parental leave, government gradually reduced employer contribution to zero. So I described the social insurance cost for employers during leave before and after the reform in this figure. So before the reform in 2000, employers paid pension and health insurance of 13% for workers who are on leave during both 3 months. This is the 3 months maternity leave, and after that you have 9 months parental leave. And they paid 13% for all of this time. In April 2000, pension insurance during 9 months parental leave were eliminated, which is depicted in this red line. So cost reduction was 9% of the workers' earning times 9 months. And then there's another reform in January 2001, health insurance during parental leave were eliminated. So I described this as a green line. It's kind of hard to see, but now it's eliminated. So cost saving for the farm was 4% times 9 months. And there was another reduction in 2014. Both the employer's pension and health insurance during maternity leave were completely eliminated. So cost reduction was 13% times 3 months. And these reforms are luckily not accompanied by an increase in the length of leave that could have the potential to shift the labor supply curve, which makes it a cleaner reform to study. Okay, so here's the data I use. I use employer-employee data from Japan. This data contains establishment and worker level record. Approximately 6% of establishment are surveyed each year, and 20% of them will continue to be surveyed next year. And I also calculate risk of having a baby by gender and age. And I make 2 major sample restrictions. I limit analysis to establishment with 10 or more employees and focus on employees who are aged 18 to 60. So in the regression, I will combine 2 main ingredients. First is the probability a worker gives birth. So I calculate this probability by age and gender. And second, the cost of employment during leave. This is the employer contribution described in % of the pre-birth income we have seen in the figure before. So we will look at 2 outcomes, starting wages and the probability of being hired on a permanent contract. And we will compare outcomes of female workers of childbearing age and older female workers and male workers. And this is the plot of cost of employment variable for female workers. So this is the interaction between risk and cost variable. So the risk is the probability a worker gives birth, and the cost is cost of employment during leave, which we saw in the figure. And we take the interaction of these 2 variables and estimate its effect on wages and permanent employment probability. And blue dot here are from before 2000. The cost is highest before 2000 compared to other years, and also it's highest around 32. And cost gradually decrease in 2000 and 2001 and 2014. So after 2014, the cost is 0 for everybody. And we're gonna use this interaction variable in the regression, so it's in here. We will focus on how the interaction variable affects an indicator for permanent contract or log of wages. An interaction variable varies across men and women of different ages, and also over time. And here, X includes control that time vary. So I control for a trend as well, and that the gamma denote the establishment fixed effect. So that's the control for the trend. And the effect of a unit increase in the cost of leave for farms on outcome is given as this equation. We would expect that the employment effect to be largest for higher risk group, and therefore we expect beta 3 to have a negative effect on outcomes. we might expect an increase in cost to reduce employment and earning for all workers, and therefore beta 1 would be negative. But there could also be general equilibrium effect from the substitution across worker types that might show up in beta 1, so that would make the sign ambiguous. Okay, so I run the regression. Now, these are the coefficients from the regression of the probability of being hired on permanent contract. The first row shows the main effect for risk. It measures the effect of a unit change in risk, that is going from a 0% chance of having baby, for example, man and older woman, to a probability of 1 when cost is 0. So these effects are large and negative here. The higher the risk of giving birth, less likely to be higher on a permanent contract. So that was shown in the table. Coefficient on cost show the effect of cost when risk is 0. That means for man and older woman. The sign is positive because it's mostly picking up the difference between man and woman. And the interaction is the one I'm focusing on. So the coefficient on the interaction pick up how the impact of cost varies with risk. And what I did is to better interpret the coefficient, we multiply the interaction coefficient by the value of risk for the highest group, which is 32 years old woman who have a value of 0.1156. And I show that in the prediction highest risk row. So we run regression with several different specifications. We included age by year fixed effect to control for trend across different age group. You can see what's in the model here. We will focus on the interaction coefficient in column 6 here. We find that $1,000 decrease in the cost increase the probability of starting on a permanent contract by 1.6 percentage point. This is 2.5% increase from the initial level. So that was the result for the probability to be hired on a permanent contract. Now we move on to the regression result for the starting pay. So again, I focus on this coefficient. $1,000 decrease in the cost increase the starting pay by 3.3%. Okay, so I next examine the heterogeneity in 2 dimensions, farm size and female employment shares. So we define a small establishment as fewer than 300 employees. Large establishment defined as having 300 or more employees. So this is the result for small, and this is the probability permanent. This is small, large, payment. So as you can see, effect larger in large establishment. A $1,000 decrease in cost increase the permanent employment by 0.7 percentage point, or 1.1% in small farm, and 3.3 percentage point, or 4.6% in large farms. Similarly, a $1,000 decrease in the cost increases the starting pay by 2.2% for small farms and 5.8% for large farms. One potential mechanism is that employment adjustment may be easier in the large farms than the small farms, because large farms may have larger margin of adjustment. For example, maybe large farm may have more discrete tasks that are easily substitutable across workers. Large farms also have more permanent workers, which resulted in more cost saving for them. But I'm still working to unpack the mechanism here. Okay, another heterogeneity is here. Since maternity and parental leave are mostly taken by female workers, firms with majority female employees may benefit more from the two reform. So I compare firms with above and below median shares of female employment. So this is low share, high share female. The magnitude of the effect on permanent employment is much bigger for firms with low female share than high female share. So $1,000 decrease in the cost increase the permanent employment by 2.8 percentage point or 3.5% for firms with low female share. It increased 1.2 percentage point or 2.5% for firms with high female share. Why is that? The low female share firms tend to be larger and have high permanent share. So they may have had a larger margin of adjustment maybe. And the result for payment show opposite effect. The reduction in the cost of employment increased starting pay by 3.8% for low female share firms and 5.4% for high female share firms. So high female share firm may have saved more money because they employ more female workers. So they probably paid back to the female. This is the final result. Finally, we run the same regression by different sample period. So magnitude of cost reduction we have seen in the figure was much bigger for the 2000 and 2001 reform than the 2014 reform. So we run separate analysis for the different sample period. Coefficient of interaction shows that $1,000 decrease in the cost increased permanent employment by 1 percentage point of 1.4% and increase in starting pay by 1.7% for the 2000 and the 2001 reform period. For the 2014 reform, coefficient are similar, but the estimate is much imprecise. This is not surprising because the cost reduction was much smaller in 2014. Okay, so to sum up, I examined the relationship between the cost of leave for firms and the labor demand for female workers of childbearing age. I find that a decrease in cost increased the permanent employment and the starting wage of female workers in childbearing age. So the implication from the research is that a higher cost of female employment may have discouraged firms to hire female workers. And these costs of employment hold back progress on gender wage and employment gaps these policies were directly designed to promote. So it indicates that the generous leave policy should be accompanied with policy which minimizes firms' monetary cost of supporting women on leave. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. And without further ado, we pass the floor to Joseph. Sorry, I hope you didn't hear my dog barking.
Great. Thank you, Claudia. And thanks to LERA for putting this session together. Thank you to Yukiko for allowing me to discuss this paper. So I have three main comments to share today. Yukiko, I can scan these and send them to you as well. So the first comment that I'd like to share is that the main results that we just saw and are characterized throughout the paper are presented in terms of 100,000 yen or roughly $1,000 USD reduction in employment costs. So for example, resulting in a 1.6 percentage point or 2.5% increase in the probability of starting on a permanent contract, or an increase in starting pay of 3.3%. These are the main takeaway findings that we hear, types of them. So the calculations as to why you do it this way are clearly shown and explained on page 18. And so if anyone is looking for that explanation, it's right there in the middle of the page. So I definitely buy the explanation as to why you do it this way, and all the logic and mathematics are shown. But given that you have multiple reforms in 2000, 2001, and in 2014, all leading to a reduction in costs, meaning they're all going the same way. And, you know, I got to say, this is really nicely shown in figures 2 and 4, which I found absolutely gorgeous. So you didn't number the figures in the presentation today, but I got to say, when I wanted to know about the reforms, those 2 figures basically just sum it all up. So those are great. So given that you have those multiple reforms, and given that your paper is written from the perspective of labor demand, i.e., from the perspective of employers, and one last given that economists cannot get enough of elasticities, I would rather, or at least additionally, would like to see the main results characterized in terms of an elasticity based on the percentage reduction in costs rather than in yen or dollar terms. So one argument I can throw out is that although I'm an American in Canada, and so then I'm doing the calculation as to what it would mean in Canadian dollars and so on, and perhaps others are doing that to their own currency here. And from the employer perspective, I'm not quite sure that means much when you can say anchored to some particular base cost. And perhaps that's really why you didn't do it that way. But given how you lay it out in figures 2 and 4, I really think you could characterize it this way in terms of a percentage reduction, and then relate that percentage change to the percentage change in outcomes, and then put the percentage point changes in parentheses rather than the other way around, which is how you have it in the paper now. So that's how I'd like to see it. Again, at least as an additional way to characterize the results and calculate the results. So then if you presented it in that way, you could characterize the impact of each reform in the same way, meaning that each reform could be associated with a percentage reduction in the cost. And then you could say this reform led to this amount, this reform led to this amount, and so on. So that's my main comment. So 2 other kind of smaller comments. So it was unclear to me why there was such a large gap in data years from 2001 to 2008. So as I understand it, the 1998, 99, 2000, and 2001 BSWS data links to the 1996 census. And then the 2008 to 2014 BSWS data also allows for a panel element. I think perhaps also through the census, although that part wasn't clear in your description on page 15. But given that the reforms are happening in 2000, 2001, and 2014, it would be nice to have more of that 2001 to 2008 period, if only to have a longer post-reform period for the 2001 change. So that's the way I saw it. I'm sure there's a great explanation as to why you can't do that. And so if that's the case, just add an additional paragraph right there on page 15 and kind of just take that element completely out of it. So lastly, my third comment is that I would like to hear more about what makes Japan an interesting case. So you currently do this. So it's not that you don't do this. You do this on pages 3 through 5. And again, when talking about the various types of social insurance on pages 8 through 10. And then also in the conclusion on page 25. But I just wanted a little bit more. And so the good news is that what I'm requesting is actually at least one paragraph describing your own publication in 2015 in labor economics, because you do cite that, but I really wondered how that paper relates to this one. And so maybe just a little paragraph kind of linking the two. I'd really appreciate that. And in addition, a few country comparisons would be great, like the data or policies in the US or in some other country just don't allow for the analysis that you're doing here on Japan. That's basically the argument you're making, but I would just kind of slam it home that, hey, most of the literature is on this country. That country has policies or data that do not allow for what I'm doing here, and just put it as starkly as possible. Thanks.
Thank you, Joseph. Shall I answer some of the question now?
Yeah, I was going to ask if you wanted to address
Okay.
Joseph's question first before we open.
Yeah, so thank you so much for reading the paper very carefully and giving me a very thoughtful comment. So I agree, definitely agree. I should definitely show elasticity, and probably maybe it helps the reader to see what's the effect of percent reduction of the cost on the permanent employment probability and payment. I would definitely add that to my paper. Thanks very much for that. Another second question, why large gap in the data from 2001 to 2008 is, as you kind of suspected, data format is a little bit different. So first, until 2001, wage survey is sampled from the employment census in specific year. So it's easy to connect those years, and another 2001 to 2008 is a kind of different type of sampling period. I could connect it. It's the same type of companies are in the data, so I could do a little bit more work to actually try to connect these data and extend and look at the long-term effect. Definitely was looking at the long-term effect as you suggested. Thank you. And another comment, what Japan makes an interesting case to study. One of the reasons was why I wrote about it's a universal program of health insurance and pension insurance, but that's the case for many countries, I guess. So I probably should show some country comparison, why this is important. One of the reasons why I did was female employment rate is so low, despite the very generous maternity leave, and we have a universal childcare system as well, but still not doing very well. So I thought it's kind of interesting comparison between European country, which it's doing very well compared to Japan, but the Japan system is great, but women have some kind of have a struggle working. So I think I will add those type of discussion, maybe create one small section about this and motivate the paper a little bit better. I think that would be a good addition to the paper, and definitely put some compare maybe employment rate between other countries, or some basic data into the paper. So thank you so much for the comment again. Thank you.
Thank you. And I can add, and I like to encourage this. It is really remarkable. The employment rate is so low. Especially given the generosity and of the policies, as you said, right, about childcare, and this is really remarkable. I mean, exercise that you can do, especially given how low employment rates are. And in fact, before I open the floor to questions. I wanted to ask you if you could comment a little bit on heterogeneity by education or other. So how does these systems work? So I've seen work done for other countries where changes in policies kind of were more regressive or progressive, depending. So in terms of workers, in terms of employment, which workers are are more educated women more likely to work than lower educated women? And did this policy affect more labor demand, so the labor cost for the one group relative to the other? So is there something that you can do, or you can tell us regarding its kind of heterogeneous effect?
Yeah, that's very like important point and an interesting aspect. I should actually do that analysis, so I will be able to know what's the education level of the employees in each company. So I should probably look at if they increased labor demand for maybe high educated or low educated females, how the distribution of the work on each education level changed before and after. That would be probably interesting
to explore.
area.
Yeah, especially,
Yeah.
I don't know exactly the details about, which group has a particularly low labor force participation.
Yeah.
I expect probably the lower educated, maybe.
Lower educated,
or maybe not. I don't know, because maybe the higher educated do not have kids. So I don't know. It would be really interesting to.
Yeah, a lot of women, even with the highly educated, leave the workplace after giving birth. So about 60% of women quit their job regardless of education level. More so for the low educated woman. So I think it'll be interesting to see. I think it may affect higher educated women more than low educated women, probably. But I will be definitely look into it more. That's a great suggestion, actually.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, the chair is not supposed to monopolize the discussion. So questions from the audience. So sorry. We still have 3 minutes. Lavinia, you can unmute yourself.
Okay, thanks a lot. Hi, everyone. Thanks for the presentation. That was really, really interesting and also super clear, very understandable. I hope I didn't miss what I'm about to ask. I just wanted to ask you whether you could say a bit more about how you calculate the risk of giving birth. Is that just the pure statistics of percentages of women who give birth at certain ages, or is it something more sophisticated than that?
Well, thank you. Thank you for the question. I didn't say much about it, actually. It's very simple. So I could do many other way, but it's for now, it's a pure statistics I took from the birth registry to say what's the probability of giving birth in a particular year for a particular age. But another way I was thinking about doing is maybe I could do a cumulative probability. So maybe the much higher for the woman in 20s and they go down by the age. Or I could do many ways, but for now, yes, it's a very simple calculation.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I was also thinking whether you use something about education or some other socio-demographics, but then it's just really your statistics. Yeah. Might be interesting. I'm not sure. Yeah,
yeah, that's actually a good suggestion. I could change around a little bit, actually. They look at by education level, by maybe geographical location. I don't know what's the best way to calculate this, but I think it's, yeah, that's definitely is that there are more to do for this one. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks.
Thank you.
So if there are no more questions, in the interest of time, given that we're going to be cut off sharply at the end of the session, I would like to, thank you both Yukiko and Joseph for a great 14 minutes, a great paper, a great discussion. This was super interesting. And I would ask Michael if you want to share your slides. So our next paper is going to be about gender differences. Or no, sorry, Jason is presenting. I'm sorry, I was fixing on Michael over there. Sorry, Jason Sockin is going to present the paper. And this is about, gender differences in performance pay using data from Glassdoor. And Guillaume, I hope I pronounced it correctly, Vermeylen, will be discussing the paper. Again, the rules of the game are 22 minutes for the presenter, 8 minutes for the 10 minutes for the discussant, and 8 minutes for Q&A at the end. Jason, you didn't see it, but I will give you 10 minutes, 5 minutes, 2 minutes on the private chat.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you. I will say it feels quite comforting to present something that's not my job market paper. So I'm pretty excited to do this. And yes, so my co-author, Michael Sockin, also my brother, is also in the chat as well. He can answer questions that arise through the Zoom chat. This is a pay scale of their own, gender differences in variable pay. And this is very much still a work in progress. So any comments or suggestions are very much welcomed and in fact encouraged. And so the motivation for this paper is that the gender gap is a pretty well appreciated phenomenon in labor markets, but relatively little is still unknown exactly about the variable pay aspect of the gender gap. And by variable pay, what I mean is really employee bonuses, this idea of cash bonuses, of stock bonuses, of a profit sharing arrangement between a worker and an employer, and also sales commissions. And so when I speak about variable pay, those are going to be the four components: cash bonuses, stock bonuses, profit sharing amounts, and sales commissions. And so what we try to get at in this paper is variable pay, or potentially being in a job that heavily relies upon variable pay, these employee bonuses, is that an important determinant of the gender gap? Do we in fact see women sort out of roles that tend to be variable paying? And we'll actually look at job seeker data to test this idea. And then finally, in the last couple of minutes, what I'll try and do is think about recent policy that's aimed at reducing the gender gap. If we do in fact see this variable pay gender gap, which we document in this paper, can recent legislation such as pay transparency laws and salary history bans, which are meant to attenuate the overall gender gap, can that actually work at reducing the variable pay component of this gender gap? And so the main takeaways, in case I'm not able to get through them all, is that using compensation data from the website Glassdoor, and I'll talk a little bit more about that sample in the next slide, is that we document sizable gender gaps in variable pay, both in magnitude, about 20% gap between men and women who earn variable pay, and in the incidence of variable pay. So women are going to be 5.6 percentage points less likely to earn variable pay than their male counterparts. What we find is that this is going to be present in all types of variable pay, in all four of those components I talked about earlier. It's going to widen over the life cycle, and I'll get into why we think that occurs. And it's also going to be evident across developed economies. In fact, we have international data, and we show that this gender gap is really an international phenomenon with regards to variable pay. And then lastly, what I'll show, if there's time, is that this variable pay gap is going to be resistant to recent policies targeting the gender gap. So salary history bans and pay transparency laws aren't going to be able to successfully attenuate the gender gaps in variable pay that we've seen so far. Second is that this gender gap in variable pay does not appear to be driven by differences in ability. Rather, it appears to reflect women working for and earning variable pay less often. So we see female job seekers, in fact, showing aversion to these roles that are more variable pay intensive. And we try and qualify why we think there is this aversion by looking at characteristics of variable paying roles. And what we find is that this job seeker aversion to variable pay intensive roles can be explained by the competitive, more senior and higher paying nature of variable pay roles. So I won't speak too much to the contributions to literature given the time constraints, but I will say there has been a recent wave of some papers thinking about the gender's earning gap with how it relates to variable pay, but most of these works tend to speak about variable pay jobs, workers maybe earning or not earning variable pay. And what we can do is specifically look at variable-based earnings directly. So here we'll actually have an empirical measure of how much workers earn in terms of these employee bonuses. The second contribution is looking at the import of gender differences in job seeker preferences and sorting for the earnings gap. And so we believe our unique contribution to this strand of the literature is documenting this relative aversion to variable pay intensive jobs. And this is going to be true. This isn't a story about occupations or industries. It's really a story of across jobs within occupations. So this idea of really variable pay type job titles within occupations. So what is the data we're going to use for this analysis? Again, it's from the website Glassdoor. It's going to cover 2.7 million different earnings reports for US workers from 2006 to 2020. We're going to restrict our sample to full-time workers who are salaried and working in the private sector. Each worker, when they leave an earnings report, is going to document conveniently for us as the econometricians base and variable earnings separately. So it'll be decomposed for us into what's earned in terms of a base wage, but what's earned in terms of cash bonuses, earned in terms of stock bonuses, in terms of profit sharing, and in terms of sales commissions. The observables we'll have for each worker at each firm, these are going to be employee-employer matches, is we'll know the firm, we'll know their job title, we'll know their location, their years of experience, and their gender. And when we talk about occupations, we're going to assign occupations according to the job title. So we'll have a mapping from job titles to occupations from Glassdoor that we'll use when we talk about within occupations. And then the last and final aspect of the data set is that we're also going to have data that's outside the US. So we'll actually have international coverage, and we're restricted to 13 different countries where we have 1,000+ observations with males and female workers who earn variable pay. And I'll show you the results for those countries as well. So, of course, whenever using a data set that's less utilized in the literature, there's concerns about external validity. And so we go into the paper to make sure that we believe that the findings that we derive from this data set really have external validity in the labor market more broadly. And so what we'll do is we'll compare first and second moments of wages, as well as the female employment share, because we're going to try and say relevant findings about how men and women sort across different opportunities, is we'll compare that with the American Community Survey. And so what we find is that when we look within industries and occupations, we find correlations about near 0.9 between American Community Survey and Glassdoor in terms of the first moment, in terms of average total pay. In terms of the standard deviation, correlation is about 0.8. And in terms of female employment share, correlation about 0.9. So we do believe that the data set we're using here, this Glassdoor earnings data set, does have external validity outside of it to reflect the labor market more broadly. So the first thing I want to show you is that this variable pay gap is going to be tied to wider overall gender gap. And I'll show you the exact numbers on the next table, but here we have two images. On the left-hand side, we're going to put on the x-axis the component of total pay that's attributable to variable earnings. So essentially the share of total pay attributable to variable pay. And on the y-axis is going to be the ratio of male to female earnings. And so as we move up the y-axis, we're having a larger overall gender gap between men and women. And as we move from the left to right on the x-axis, we're getting a larger share of male earnings relative to females in terms of variable pay. And what we find is a very stark, robust, positive relationship there. And this is what we're going to think about as the intensive margin of variable pay. As the share of earnings from total earnings become more variable based, we see larger gender gaps arising across job titles. On the right-hand side, we're going to do a similar exercise, but instead of looking at this intensive margin of what share of total pay is attributable to variable pay, we're going to think about it along the extensive margin of the share of workers that earn variable pay or earn a bonus. And so again, what we see is that both of these margins really do seem to matter, is that as we move from the left to the right side of these two graphs, as the difference between male and female workers within a job title, as the difference in variable pay becomes more and more stark, right, in terms of the intensive or extensive margins, we see that the ratio of male to female earnings becomes more disparate. That larger gender gaps in variable earnings translate into larger gaps in overall earnings. And so throughout the talk, I'm going to introduce a measure. I don't have too much time to do it in the paper, but I'm going to call the variable pay intensity, or the principal component of variable pay. And that's going to be combining these two margins, the extensive and the intensive margin, in order to create one uniform metric that captures how variable pay intensive a job is. It's going to be a combination of the extensive margin, the share of workers that earn variable pay, and the intensive margin, the share of total earnings that we can attribute to variable pay. And that's how variable pay intensive a job is going to be. In terms of the exact magnitudes, right, what we show is that even when we look within occupations and within employers, we find these very large or quite sizable gaps in the incidence and magnitude of variable pay. So we find that for base earnings in our data set, we find a gender gap about 6%, right? In terms of variable-based earnings, log variable pay, we find a gender gap of about 20%. And this translates into a pretty sizable gap in total earnings, right? In the sense that we find about an 8% gap in total pay. So variable pay is going to account for more than 1/4 of the residual gender gap within occupations and firms. So we think about variable pay, that can be a quite meaningful import for the overall gender gap. And if we look at the extensive margin, that final column, that women are 5.6 percentage points less likely than men within the same occupation and firm to earn a bonus. If we take a look across the sort of different countries I talked about, we have data for 14 countries for which we have variable-based earnings for male and female workers. We find that this gender gap in both magnitude and in incidence seems prevalent across advanced economies. We don't have very many developing countries. We do have India, so we can't say too much about whether or not it's about developing and developed countries, but across developed economies, this seems like a pretty pervasive phenomenon that we find gender gaps in the magnitude of variable pay from 10 to 20%, and we find gender gaps in the incidence from about 3 to 7%. So it seems like this isn't just about the United States or US labor market, it seems relevant across advanced economies. And then in the paper, we go through a host of different exercises to try and figure out more about understanding this variable pay gender gap. What we find is that even when we look within job title, that male and female workers that have the same job, we still see a persistent gender gap about 15% in magnitude. So it's not necessarily about within jobs, we still see this gender gap arising. It doesn't seem to be related to differences in growth rates, right? If we take our panel of workers and look at if male and female employees have different rates of growth, variable, they actually don't seem to show statistically different rates of growth. So it's not about growth rates of variable pay. It's not driven by any specific industries or occupations or firms. It seems pretty pervasive across all industries, across all occupations. It doesn't seem to be driven by experience, tenure, or seniority. So we go into maybe these typical explanations for why the overall gender gap arises, but the gender gap in variable pay doesn't seem to be related to either of these human capital related components. It's going to be present regardless of how variable pay intensive a job is. So whether or not this is a job that rarely utilizes variable pay or quite often does, we still see women earning less in variable pay. And then it's not going to be explained by differences in productivity. And here we'll actually use educational histories through resumes that we have access through the website. And so we can actually look at male and female workers who graduate from the same university and study the same program, that even for those similar, very similar workers, we find these large gender gaps. So it doesn't seem to be proxy for what we proxy for as productivity. That doesn't seem to be driving this variable pay gap. What we introduce is potentially this idea that there are differences in job transitions and sorting, that women might be more inclined to leave jobs that are variable pay intensive. And so here we take a look at our panel of workers. So here we're going to have male and female employees who report their earnings in consecutive years, and think about, do we see differences in the incidence and magnitude of variable pay depending upon the job transitions that these workers make. And so what we find is that in these first two columns, that women are more likely to stop earning variable pay and less likely to start earning variable pay. So even conditioning on the same initial industry and occupation, so that women are 7.6 percentage points more likely to stop earning variable pay and 4.9 percentage points less likely to start earning variable pay. So in these job transitions, we see differences in these rates of incidence. We see that once women do start earning variable pay, so if they do go from a position of not earning variable pay to earning it, we see that they start at a large discount, about 23%, which is equivalent to about $3,700 on average in our sample. So we see that women start at this significant discount when they do start earning variable pay. And we see that part of this looks like it's attributable to the types of jobs that women and men are entering into, is that what we call a variable pay job is a job that where maybe ex ante you expect to earn a bonus. So if more than 1/2 of employees earn a bonus in that job title, we'd say this is maybe an ex ante expectation. And so we see that women are less likely to enter a variable pay job and more likely to exit a variable pay job. So it seems like women or men are making different job transitions based upon the variable pay intensity of the jobs they're going to enter into. And what we find is this translates into quite a stark slope or disparity in how men and women sort across employment opportunities. And so, as I mentioned before, this variable pay intensity measure is going to be this principal component of the extensive and intensive margins. And so what we'll do on the x-axis here is actually just rank jobs or employers by how variable pay intensive they are. So from left to right, we're going from the least to the most variable pay intensive. Right, so these industry job titles or industry occupations of these employers on the right-hand side of this graph are going to be those that use variable pay the most often, right? And what we plot on the y-axis is the share of workers in that industry job title or in that firm that are going to be female in our data set. And what we find is a sharp decline and seemingly almost monotonic in the share of workers who are female in these roles that are increasingly more variable pay intensive. So as jobs or companies start using variable pay more intensively, we see that women are increasingly less likely to be in those roles. And so what we look to then test is whether or not this can be attributed to differences in preferences, right? Do we see differences in how job seekers actually apply to roles depending on how variable pay intensive they are? And so what we'll do is we'll take from our wage data, again, we have this sort of measure of how variable pay intensive a job is. We know the job title from their wage reports. And what we'll do is we'll merge that information into our job seeker data. So we'll actually look on Glassdoor and look at how different users are applying to job postings. And based on the job title of that job posting, assign it a variable pay intensity from our wage data. Right, so we have the job titles in our wage data. We see low and high variable pay intensity in those workers. And we take that to this job seeker data and we say, do men and women actually apply differently to jobs depending upon how variable pay intensive there are? And so on this left-hand side, we're going to do the log of the total number of applies that these job postings receive. And here apply is for a user clicking start an application on these postings. So this is a user clearly showing interest in wanting to potentially join the firm. And an impression on this right-hand side, we're gonna have this ratio, an impression is being presented with the job. So on this right-hand side, it's sort of the share of jobs that people apply to conditional on being presented. So what's the rate at which you're applying to jobs? And so what we see on this left-hand side is that male and female job seekers appear to apply differently to roles depending on how variable pay intensive they are. That we see that for male job seekers, we see that the level of apply sort of peaks sort of in the middle of this variable pay intensity, whereas for female job seekers, it peaks towards the bottom or the least variable pay intensive roles. And in terms of the rate at which these job seekers apply, we do see that they both are decreasing. So we see both men and women apply less to more variable pay intensive roles, but we see that gap widening as the jobs become more variable pay intensive. So what we see is that female job seekers show relatively more aversion to variable pay intensive job opportunities, right, through this application on this job board. And so what we'll try to do is derive or exactly decompose this effect we see into aspects of these jobs that are variable pay intensive. So in these first two columns, what we show is, again, women are less likely to apply to jobs that are more variable pay intensive. And once we include industry occupation fixed effects, so again, this isn't a story about sorting across occupations. This is a story of sorting across jobs within occupations. And what we find is that in this third column, when we add these different characteristics of variable pay intensive roles, such as having more variable earnings, being potentially more competitive, where a larger share of your bonuses might be based on sales commissions, being a managerial role, potentially differences in job satisfaction or different levels of seniority, how many average years of experience these jobs require. What we find is that one thing that stands out is that women are increasingly less likely to apply to jobs where sales commissions are an increasingly large share of bonuses, this potential aversion to more competitive roles. In this fourth column, we show that it's not just about being higher paying, right? So we do see this aversion to higher paying roles, but our coefficient on this variable pay intensity isn't completely dwindled. until we include all of those characteristics, in which case it seems like the higher paying and more competitive nature of variable paying jobs leads to this relative female aversion to variable paying intensive jobs. And the last thing I'll do, I think I have another minute. I have another minute or two, is try and think about policy interventions or policy implications here. So we document that variable pay gap is a large share of the residual gap, and it seems like there's a representation gap where women and men are sorting differently across these opportunities. Can recent policies such as salary history bans and pay transparency laws effectively reduce this gender gap? Right, what we've seen in recent years is 13 states and 5 metropolitan areas have imposed salary history bans, in which case that restricts employers from being able to inquire about prior earnings. And 17 states have passed pay transparency laws, which permits workers to share information among each other about their pay. Right, so both of these are sort of trying to target and attenuate gender gaps in earnings. What we find is that when we relate this to our data, right, we can actually look at a panel of workers. So we observe the same worker reporting their earnings before and after these policies go into place. So for the same employee or the same worker, we find that after these salary history bans and after these pay transparency laws go into effect, and we don't try to make a causal argument one or the other, there's a lot of overlap in these. And so we sort of feel reassured that we find the same patterns in both. And so we see that these general policies show that when these policies go into place, that after this legislation is enacted, we see that a relative increase in female earnings compared to male. So we do find that for base pay, that the gender gap attenuates by about 1.5 to 2 percentage points, equivalent to about 20% of the within occupation gender gap. However, when we look at the magnitude and the incidence of variable pay, we find that these salary history bans and pay transparency laws don't effectively attenuate the gender gap. So perhaps these policies are effective with base earnings, where there's maybe this sort of salience of this posted wage, but when it comes to variable based earnings, we don't see this attenuation. So we think that there's clear implications here that perhaps this variable pay gap is something more structural and requires different intervention than these typical ones that we've seen in recent years. And so with that, I'll just provide my concluding remark, which is that we see variable-based earnings as a significant contributor to the gender gap across advanced economies, not just the US, and it's evident even when we look within the same roles and the same companies. And this reliance on variable pay, or maybe the working environments that are induced by variable pay, clearly affect how men and women sort across jobs. So maybe this perhaps speaks to a permanent representation gap. There will always be a disparity between the male and female share of workers within jobs that are more variable pay intensive, if it is about job seeker preferences. And then finally, does the non-transparency or the opacity of variable pay, that these are employee bonuses that there may not be much information about, does this make the component of the gender gap, this relatively large residual share, perhaps structural, right? You know, the fact that they're impervious to these salary history bans and pay transparency laws means that we might need new interventions to try and reduce or attenuate this fraction of the gender gap. And with that, I'll conclude.
Thank you, Jason. Super interesting talk. So the discussant would be Guillaume Vermeylen, and I pronounced your last name wrong, I'm sure. So I'm sorry, but I don't know if you have slides you want to share.
Yeah, I have some slides. So I will share my screen.
Yeah.
So there it is. I think you can see my slides. I will try to play it. Well, is that clear? So perfect. So first of all, well, thank you, Jason and Michael, for giving me the opportunity to read and to review your paper. So I prepared some slides. So first of all, to get back to the overview. So you try to focus on pay gap between women and men, and more specifically on variable pay differences. And you highlight something that is persistent, so a persistent in the gap in variable pay that is present across occupations, industries, and countries. And you also show that this gap cannot be explained by differences in workers' observables, latent ability, and income growth. Well, you wisely mentioned in the paper that this is a crucial topic, and this is something that has to be investigated in US, but also everywhere in the world. Well, I think that this is an underexplored topic. I share your point about that, but it's mainly due to data availability, I think. Well, this paper is clearly interesting. It's really interesting. It's well documented and well written. It's also well positioned in the literature, which is maybe the strongest part of this paper. You went really far in the analysis. You add new insight in the explanations of learning gaps. So really good job for that. And also the policy implications at the end of the paper, they are straight, they are nicely developed, and they clearly deserved that space in the paper. So good job for that. So of course I have some comments, and I divided my comments into major and minor ones. So first, the first one, maybe the most important one, is that so you are making comparisons between all the coefficients in all your models, but I was wondering, are these coefficients statistically different? So in other words, did you run some tests of difference between means? I think this is really important and this is crucial. And well, maybe one referee, once you would like to publish this paper, will get into that point. The coefficients, they should be statistically different so that you can compare them. So I don't know if you did such test. If so, you should mention it clearly in the paper. If not, I suggest you to run some t-test of difference between the coefficients. Then my second comment is that I think you deserve, the paper deserves a clearer methodological section that could be missing in such a way. For example, it's not clear enough which regression method you are using until the end of the paper in the tables, where I can see that you rely on ordinary least square or fixed effects, and maybe it should be mentioned in the methodological part of the paper, and well, it should be discussed a bit. Then this one, based on that, this comment is based on the second one. The fixed effect may still lead to some biases, and you should be aware of that, and at least you should mention it in your limitations. For example, so for example, you can control with fixed effects for time invariant characteristics, but there is still some other biases, such as reverse causality or simultaneity, and you can have these biases in your data. So either you should explain it in your paper, or maybe you can run some robustness tests in order to be sure that there is no reverse causality in your data. Then the next comment, it's a major or minor one. It depends. Well, you explain lots of variables that can explain the gaps, but I thought about another one. Well, easy for me because it's my research topic. It's the mismatch situation of a worker. The mismatch means that you can have a worker that gets a job that does not correspond to its level of education or training, and mainly we talk about over-education. And this over-education appears when you possess more skills than it's required. So it has been shown in the literature that this mismatch, this over-education may explain some differences in earnings. And on the top of that, we saw that women are more likely to suffer from this phenomenon. So if I mix everything, over-education may be one variable that could explain why women are discriminated to a bigger extent than men. And it could be one moderating variable in our data. So I don't know if you are able to measure this matching between the level of education that the workers get and the one that is required for the job, but this could explain some differences in earnings. Then I have a couple of minor comments. For example, on page 6, you talk about 200 as a cutting point, but I don't know if you talk about $200 or $200,000. I think there is a typo right here. And also you decided to exclude the top 0.01% of your data. I was wondering why this level. Is it trivial in the literature? Maybe, but it should be explained why you choose this level, this cutoff level. And finally, maybe in a way to increase to increase the quality of your regressions. Some papers, they use the lack of earnings outcome as independent variable. It increases a lot the quality of the regressions. So I was wondering why not trying this. Well, that's really all. Good luck. It was a really interesting paper. I enjoyed reading it. So congratulations for that. And that's not anymore a first draft at all. So I make it quick. So thank you very much.
Thank you. So Jason, Michael, do you want to first address this point before we open for questions?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I would say first, just thank you for reading and discussing our paper. I know everyone has so much work on their own that they're working on, so it's just nice to get someone who can read our paper and give us some great feedback. There are a few things. So one point you brought up, I think the one that I was thinking most about was this idea of mismatch and overeducation. And I was trying to figure out which way that would point the bias. And I actually think that would make the gender gaps we document even understated, right? Because then within a job title, the women would have relatively more education than men, and thus within a job would have potentially be more productive or higher earnings for that. So I think that would actually lead to potentially biasing our estimates even downward. And so I think you're right. I think it's worth looking into, but I don't think that's going to be driving the findings that we have. So even within the job title, we find these pretty persistent gaps. I would say that in terms of the thresholds that you bring up, in terms of lag earnings, we actually do have a robustness table. I hope it didn't get dropped in this draft in the appendix, where we do an AR1 process and we sort of show that there is this sort of persistence in male and female earnings. And so it doesn't seem like with variable rates based on log growth about some level of differences in persistence. It seems more about this idea that women more often stop earning variable pay unless we set their variable-based earnings. And so I think we can do a robustness. I said that there's sort of a lot of robustness checks you sort of suggest. I think we can all sort of do those. I don't think it'll change our top line findings very much. Thank you.
So sorry to tag team. I just want to thank you for your wonderful comments. We're always looking to improve, find ways to make it better, know where our sharp shortcomings are in terms of our analyses. And I think the mismatch is kind of interesting because we did find that conditioning on like the level of managerial role, women tend to be paid more within the same managerial role because they have more years of experience. And they seem to be like, if we think about the average years of experience required for a role across all employees, we find women tend to be slightly above this actually. So that's at least as far as I can see in terms of the mismatch. And that was something interesting we found that maybe we should look into more. But thanks so much again. It's really helpful for me personally to see, to know how we can improve.
Thank you.
So we have two questions already. First one, I think, is Teresa, and then Patrick. Teresa Kroeger and Patrick.
Yes. Hi. So I first want to say great presentation. That was really engaging. And I would like Michael to answer questions in the chat while I present as well. That was great. So the findings from your study are in line with the anecdotal stories that I have heard of women working for variable pay. So that was really good to hear, and maybe helps you as well. I think that, the stories I've heard have a lot to do with sexist conditions and harassment, and that impacts a woman's willingness to stay in the job, or whether it's her choice or not, and also the pay that she receives. And so one small note on language is when we talk about gender pay gaps, I always try to make the effort to say receive rather than earn, because it's not necessarily that they're earning less, but that they're receiving less. And, you know, one explanation, I think economists, it's easy to view always women are, all the women in the workforce as mothers who really just are trying to balance home life, which is not always true, but the explanation I can hear is income volatility. So maybe women don't want these jobs because the income is too volatile and they have a family to support, and it's too much trouble. So it could be good to answer that question about volatility and kind of give a sense of how volatile these jobs are from anecdotal stories. That's not the deterrent, but I'd be interested to see what you can come up with in the data. So I think that could really round out the research, and I'm really excited. Thanks.
Yeah, let me just first say that thank you. I'm very sympathetic to this idea of receive versus earn, and so I'll be sure to incorporate that going forward. In terms of the anecdotal stories, I mean, it's nice to hear that it aligns with what we think, but there's also terrible stories to hear, so it makes me kind of frustrated and infuriated. So one thing I will say is that, you know, if there are articles or op-eds or discussions about that we could cite showing that, that would also be great. It'd be nice to incorporate this sort of anecdotal evidence into it to sort of reaffirm this narrative. I will say, in terms of income volatility, we do actually try to test for that. So I may have went a little bit quickly just given the time constraints, but one of the aspects that we do with the search data is that, because again, we have this wage data and we bring it over to the job seeker data through the job titles, that in our wage data, we'll calculate the variance of earnings that workers in our data experience. And then so we'll rank or basically bring this volatility measure over. And as you sort of said, that we don't really find high variation in wages really driving job seeker earnings. So it doesn't seem like that story is at play.
I think.
Hello, Jason, Michael, excellent paper. I'd actually like to read it. So, you know, if you ever get a chance to send it to me, I'd be more than happy to comment on it further. One thing I just wanted to bring up that I've come across in some of my research, done a little bit of research on the same type of topic as you guys are doing, is one thing I've noted is that it kind of depends on what type of performance pay one receives. For example, there's some prior evidence that women are actually more likely to be paid piece rates than other forms of performance pay. Again, I reference a paper you'd referenced before. I saw in your presentation by Geddes and Haywood that has specifically looked at that within the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, which has some sporadic data on performance pay. And I was just wondering, does the data you have for Glassdoor allow you to split out by what type of performance pay they receive in terms of, like, for instance, bonuses versus commissions versus, you know, incentive, other types of incentive pay?
Yeah, I apologize, Patrick. This might be a dual effort again, make a tag team from Michael and I in this response. But I will say that the data does get partitioned out into each type of variable pay. So in the paper, we have an appendix where we tend to focus on the gap overall, but we actually show that for cash bonuses, for sales commissions, for profit sharing, and for stock bonuses, that we see both these incidents and these magnitude gaps are persistent. And even we go a little bit further and say that there's even a gap conditional on earning more than one type of variable pay, because quite often with managers or sort of high-ranking employees, they might actually earn a cash and stock, or they might earn part of profits and cash. And so that conditional on earning one, women are increasingly less likely to earn a second bonus compared to men. So we are able to actually partition that, and I'll let Michael potentially speak to the letter for that.
Oh, yes. Well, thank you. Tag teaming hopefully works. I'm not sure if you agree or not, but hopefully it does. Yeah, so that's one wonderful thing about having all these variable pay measures is we have 4 different types, and that kind of created a wealth of results for us that we kind of had to pare down to focus more on the bottom line base pay. You have one number, variable pay, we have like 5 numbers overall in each type. But there are interesting differences. We find women are less likely to earn stock, for instance, than men, and they do tend to receive more sales commission. So hopefully that might be in line with your intuition. But of course, I refer you to paper for more details. And if you have any suggestions, you know, we just have a plethora of things we can do along these additional dimensions, as you rightly pointed out. Thank you.
Thanks.
So can I just say one thing? I would be careful there though, right? Because the type of occupations or positions that receive sales commissions are very different from those that receive stock options usually. So you're talking about kind of different groups, different types of jobs, different types of careers. So I think, I mean, and again, so I think I was wondering when you were showing the results with kind of share of female and incidence prevalence of incentive pay, when you were looking at, you know, within occupation industry versus within employer, right? So you could think different stories, right? You could have that within an employer, women select into positions, occupations, I want to call, that differ by the prevalence of the incentive pay. Or you could have that for the same position, you know, I'm a kind of certain level managers, women, and men select into employers of different, they're sorting into type of employers, I don't know, very large firms that are more likely to, or, you know, competitor or whatever you want to call it, they're more likely to give a lot of stock options versus kind of smaller local, I'm thinking about the finance sector. So, you know, you kind of, it's really nuanced. And again, going back to Patrick's question, then, you know, the whether you're paid by the piece versus other types of incentive. And it's great that you have all these different kinds, but they're speaking to different mechanisms. So, you know, it's kind of very nuanced.
I would just say, I know we're sort of brushing up against our time here. I will say that one thing that we want to do is, like, I think one of the richness of our data is being able to exactly measure, you know, within a very nuanced, you know, granular level of work, which is a job title, you know, the intensity of which, you know, stock options are used, with sales are used. So you're right, there could be this sort of compositional effect of, you know, the share of workers in each of these. So it's something we've thought about exploring in future work, of trying to think about, you know, providing this kind of measure of variable pay intensity or stock option intensity by jobs, by companies, so that other workers can use that. But I guess what you're saying is there would be actually a lot of value to doing that. Yeah,
that's really interesting. And I see Teresa's point over there, and I agree with that too. So, but I mean, my own fault for pushing us overboard. I mean, I think we should move to the next paper, which is Teresa Kroeger is going to present a very interesting paper on the evolution of gender inequality in a category of job that is usually underexplored, and the discussant will be Valentine, Fays. Teresa, please go ahead.
Thank you. Let me get this sharing going. Let's see. Is this, no, that's not right. Can you see the slides? I don't think you can you? Okay. Sorry. Okay, can you see them now? Oh, wait, I can't see people. Sorry, Claudia, can you tell me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, so I'll be turning us to federal earnings and gender inequality. So I previously titled this including gender segregation, but I decided to just focus on earnings, which I think puts it in today's session really well. So I'll talk about gender pay differentials in the federal civilian workforce from 1973 to 1997. My name is Teresa. I'm a PhD candidate at the Heller School at Brandeis, and this research is part of my dissertation. So I asked three main questions in this study. First, is there a difference between the average earnings of men and women in the federal workforce during this period? And spoiler alert, the answer is yes, but I go further than that. So I ask, are there differences in measurable worker and job characteristics that explain those differences in pay between men and women in the federal workforce? So my answer is partially, but there is a gender pay gap that persists beyond differences in education, experience, occupation, race, and pay plan. And then finally, I ask, do changes in these characteristics over time reduce women's pay differential with men? So we know that women make a lot of progress during this time in educational attainment. So does that close the gap? Again, the answer is partially, but gender pay gaps decline by roughly half across the 25-year period, but they don't close completely. So now I'll go into a little bit of how I come to these conclusions, and a little bit of an overview of the impact of this research. So the results of this study have the potential to impact pay equity for millions of women. The federal government is the single largest employer in the United States, and it has the power to implement pay equity policies within its own workforce, as well as in the private sector, and setting standards for the broader labor market. As such a large employer, it can induce competition. So the data I'll be talking about today end in 1997, but results from those 25 years of federal employment are not independent of today's workforce. So we'll likely see these patterns perpetuated today, and as they were established during this period of really high growth in women's labor force participation. And now there are also theoretical implications of this research. I think it's really valuable to analyze more than just full-time white-collar workers, which has seldom been done before for the federal workforce. And it also establishes a longitudinal review of women's earnings in the federal government for future literature to build upon. And finally, I'm excited to bring this federal data set to the economics conversation where I haven't seen it before. So this study is the first decomposition of gender pay gaps for all federal workers using a complete data set that spans 25 years. There are 7 studies on federal earnings thus far, and they all use the same source of federal personnel data, which I also use. So some present unadjusted gender pay gaps, but few of them decompose those gaps to better understand what explains the pay gap between men and women and what contributes to it. I found one study that includes all federal workers, but the rest of the research restricts their analyses to specific white collar workers, usually kind of GS, permanent full-time workers. So this leaves us with a lack of understanding of pay gaps among the other third of the federal workforce, or more in some cases. And then some of the more recent studies use the complete data set, but many past studies use only a 1% or 20% random sample. And a couple of the studies cover longer periods of time, 15 and 20 years, but the rest use only a few years of data for their analyses. So that's where this study contributes something that really hasn't been done before. So the data for this study that I'm using are from OPM's Central Personnel Data File, the CPDF. So the CPDF includes almost all federal civilian employees in the executive branch, independent agencies, and some agencies in the legislative branch. So certain agencies are exempt from reporting data to OPM, and those are primarily intelligence agencies where the publication of worker data would pose a security threat. So these agencies don't ever report data on their workers, think CIA. So this is a population data set. So all workers who are in the agencies are reported. It's not a sample. So the CPDF is a census of the employment and earnings in the federal workforce. The data set I'm working with in this study spans from 1973 to 1997. It's at the person year level. So I have about 2 million workers a year and about 6.5 million unique individuals across the 25-year period. So the sample includes all federal workers who are paid annually or hourly who have a unique ID variable. So this is a majority of the data set. I'm only eliminating about 3% with these restrictions. My dependent variable for all of the analyses is log annual earnings. So I use a variable for basic pay that excludes any supplements, locality adjustments, overtime, any additional payments. The variable's annualized by OPM, and I've Windsorized it. And so I run fixed effects regression models that I'll discuss in more detail what variables are included in each model as I show the results. I do want to note that the CPDF is a population data set, not a sample, so tests of statistical significance are not appropriate. So I'll be discussing the effect sizes and the trends over time. This is following the practice of other authors who have used the complete data set. Even if you disagree with me and you think of it as a sample, the extremely large number of observations results in statistical significance at the 0.1% confidence level for all coefficients here. So I have 50 million observations in this data set. So I do want to give a quick overview of the federal government's pay plans. There are more than 160 different pay plans in this study sample alone, and OPM groups them into 4 categories. So you might have heard of some of these. So first, we have the general schedule and equivalently graded pay plans. So you might have heard of the GS system, or I might also refer to it as GSEG because it includes those that are scaled the same way. Then we have prevailing rate pay plans, and these are your blue collar occupations. Then we have other white collar pay plans. So general schedule are white collar jobs, and then other white collar that are graded differently fall into this category, and that includes the senior executive service that you might have heard of. And then we also have a group for unspecified or not applicable. So I include this to understand who's not included in the other groups of pay plans. So I want to give a snapshot of how these pay plans compare at the beginning of the period in 1973. So most workers in the federal government are paid on the GS and equivalent pay plans, 70% of total federal employment. About a quarter of workers are in the blue collar pay plans, and about 3% in each of the other categories. The share of women varies by type of pay plans. So women are 41% of GS and equivalent workers. Women are only 9% of the blue collar workers. And they're about half of the white collar workers, but as we can see, this is a small percentage of overall employment and a third of the other unspecified workers. So overall, women comprise 34% of federal employment in 1973. And by the end of the period, 1997, they're 44% of total federal employment. So we can also compare the pay of each type of pay plan. So the highest median and average earnings are found in the other white collar pay plans, followed by the GS and equivalent. The blue collar pay plans receive much lower pay, and we can see that the unspecified group is also picking up some of the lowest paid federal workers. This pattern holds for both men and women, and we can see that women do receive lower average and median earnings than men in each of these pay plans, and this is true in both 1973, which I show here, and 1997. So I want to start by looking at average unadjusted gender pay gaps. So these regressions estimate the impact of gender on log annual earnings, controlling only for year. So first we have the pay gap just for workers on the GS and equivalent pay plans, as this is where most of the literature focuses. And then on the right, I have the gender pay gap for all federal workers. So we can see that women in the federal workforce between 1973 and 1997 received 2/3 of the salaries of men in the same year. So 34% lower earnings for women compared to men. And this unadjusted gap is bigger for the GS workers. We can see that over time, over the 25-year period, the unadjusted gender pay gap persists, and then we can also see it decline. We see a pretty similar pattern for both groups. So later in this presentation, I'll explore the relationship between pay plan and earnings equity further, but for now, I'll go forward with just the all federal workers group, which, as we can see, has kind of overall smaller gaps to begin with. So this is going to be the more conservative estimate. So I have that total gap that we just saw for all federal workers, 34% lower earnings for women. And I run the regression on log annual earnings, controlling for gender with year fixed effects. And I can add additional controls to decompose this gap. So I start with veterans preference. This is the federal government system of providing hiring advantages to veterans of the military based on their service and service-related disability status. So 57% of the men in the data set receive veterans preference compared to 6% of women. So there's a very big difference here. So this is why I start with it. We do see the inclusion of veterans preference in the model, accounting for 1 percentage point of the pay gap. So interpreting this through past literature, this is likely picking up the men's greater likelihood of being hired into higher paying positions. And then I can continue to add variables from there. So I'm adding next experience. I'm accounting for both federal and non-federal experience. So I have years in federal service, federal civil service, not the military. And then I have potential non-federal experience. So that's our age minus years of education, minus the years in federal service, minus 6. So including the federal and non-federal experience and their squares accounts for 2 percentage points of the pay differential on average. We can see that also men have on average 4 years more of federal experience and women have 2 more years of potential non-federal experience. And so we see that account for 2 percentage points. I then add education. I have 22 categories of highest education attained. I use all 22 categories, but just to kind of give an overview, 1 in 5 women have a bachelor's degree or higher compared to 2 in 5 men. So we do see a much bigger impact of education on pay. 12 percentage points of the unadjusted gap between men and women is due to differences in educational attainment. So to put it the other way and summarize what we're seeing right now, women in the federal government receive 19% lower average annual earnings than men who have the same educational attainment, years of experience, and veterans preference. But I can keep adding variables to the regression. So I add 3 categories of supervisor status, where men are twice as likely to be a supervisor or manager. I add 3 categories of work schedule. Most of the workers, both men and women, are full-time permanent workers. And I also control for over 3,200 county and state fixed effects. So, and to give a quick overview of that, most men and women, 81% of men and 76% of women, are in the DC, Maryland, or Virginia area. So we have less variation there. So supervisor status accounts for an additional percentage point of the pay gap, but work schedule and county do not have any impact on the gender coefficient. And I then add detailed occupation and agency or bureau to the regressions. So forthcoming research by me studies the phenomenon of occupational segregation in the context of the federal workforce more closely. But in the interest of this paper, I control for occupation and agency in order to compare workers who perform similar work and to begin to understand how much of the gender pay gap may be driven by occupational and agency segregation. So I have 500 occupations and about 1,000 agencies and their sub-elements, which we know as bureaus. So the addition of occupation to the regression reduces the gender pay gap from 18% to 7% lower earnings for women. Including agency does not change the coefficient on women. And all of these variables together, including gender and year, explain 91% of total variation in pay across the data set. So ultimately, after controlling for variables that determine a worker's value and earnings potential, women in the federal workforce are paid 7% lower earnings than comparable men doing comparable work. So this is the unexplained portion of the gender pay gap that might be attributable to discrimination, and it's not accounted for by any variables that I could find in the data set. I can take a closer look at how that adjusted gender pay gap, that unexplained portion, changes over the 25-year period. So we see it at a peak of 11% in 1979, and then around 1992, it plateaus at 5%, which it stays at through the end of the period in 1997. So it declines by roughly half over the period, just as we saw in the unadjusted gap as well. So these unadjusted and adjusted gender pay gaps represent the average earnings for all women and men across the period in the federal workforce. But we know that gender pay disparities persist by race and ethnicity, and that race and gender interact to produce unique pay penalties for different gender and racial identities. So I want to get a glimpse of this by I add an interaction of gender and race ethnicity to the model. So the coefficient on this shows the unadjusted gender pay gaps by race and ethnicities compared to with white men. And then I also add the variables from the overall model to show the adjusted gap, that unexplained portion. So for example, our first bar on the left, we have white women. They have a 36% unadjusted gap with men, controlling only for a year. And then after the controls, additional controls are added, the gap is an 8% lower earnings for white women compared to white men. On average from 1976, which is when the race data began, to 1997, each racial group has lower unadjusted and adjusted earnings compared to white men. Then the unexplained gender pay gaps also vary upwards of 5 percentage points between women in different racial and ethnic groups. So we can see between 6 and 11% unexplained pay gaps. So that 7% we saw earlier has a lot of variation in it by race. When we look at that unexplained portion over time, we see similar patterns as we saw for women overall. We see that same decline. But we also see progress stalling much sooner for some groups of women. So Native women represented by the black line versus white women represented by the orange line. And we also never see the gap fall below 5% for any of the women in the sample. And this is again compared with white men. So women of all races are paid lower annual earnings compared to white men. And if we add men of other races to the graph with the gray dashed lines, we can see that women are also always paid less than men in their racial group. So I can repeat this analysis of unadjusted and adjusted gender pay gaps by type of pay plan. So first I interact gender and pay plan, controlling only for a year to get the unadjusted gap. And then I add administrative variables that characterize how a worker's pay is set, how frequently they're paid, some really specific administration variables that are specific to the federal workforce. And then I also add all the variables that we discussed earlier, from veterans preference to agency. So in the paper, I add these variables incrementally, but I want to show the fully adjusted gap with everything in the model. So here again are the unadjusted gaps in gray, ranging from 25 to 55%, lower earnings for women, and then the adjusted gaps or the unexplained portion shown by the orange bars. So starting with the left bar, women on the GS or equivalent systems with the same pay basis, veterans preference, agency, all of these variables that we have listed out on the left, exact same as men, are paid an average of 7% lower annual earnings than men who are also on the GS or equivalent system. So the unexplained gap is as high as 24% for women in blue collar pay plans. And for these women in blue collar pay plans, the variables on the left barely explain any of the pay gap with men. It only changes by 1%. So I think it's a really important finding that the gender pay gap persists across each type of pay plan and to varying extents. As I mentioned before, most of the literature focuses on GS, general schedule workers, and we see a lot of variation here by pay plan type. So to summarize, the gap between men's and women's average earnings can be partially explained by differences in veterans preference, experience, education, and supervisor status. Occupational segregation accounts for an additional 11 percentage points of the gender pay gap, and ultimately 7 percentage points of the earnings gap between men and women is unexplained by variables in the data set. We do see federal pay gaps decline by half across the period for both the explained and unexplained portions of the gap. So I imagine you still have questions, and I do too. This is the first part of my dissertation. So next I plan to study the extent of occupational and agency segregation by gender in the federal workforce over the period, and the spillover effects of federal gender segregation and earnings to the private sector. I was also unable to cover in this paper what happens after 1998 to present day. So these data are available and I have them, but they require some more sophisticated linking. That's a longer term project. And this study also only scratches the surface of racial pay inequities in the federal workforce. So I think this deserves its own study of the unique dynamics of race and federal employment. So the findings show that federal gender pay gaps persist beyond differences in education, experience, and occupations across 25 years. Gender equity initiatives in the federal workforce are largely aimed at increasing women's representation in high-paying fields through increased education and training. But these findings suggest that current gender initiatives may be insufficient in closing the gender pay gap. During this period, women with the same education and experience as men were still paid lower wages. So federal policies should also target equitable placement of workers in the pay system. And there are unexplained gaps throughout the pay scale, especially for women in blue-collar jobs. So hiring women in high-paying jobs doesn't resolve pay discrimination for the lower-paid workers. So I'm really excited to continue this research. I solicit your feedback to make this work even better. So thank you very much.
Thank you. So without further ado, Valentine.
Thanks, Claudia. Thank you, Teresa, for your presentation. It was really clear and really well done. Of course, I have some questions and comments, and I will go right away to the comments because I believe I don't have many times to comment this. First, in the literature section, you bring in your text, and you speak in your text about previous authors and work about your specific country and your specific time period. And I would like you to add a little bit of literature about work that has been done later in the US or elsewhere also, because I imagine this topic has been studied in other countries. Maybe that could be useful to compare, for example, with the US. Then coming to your dependent variable, you use the annual basic pay, and I would like to know why you don't use another definition of wage, because a broader definition of wage should lead to a broader estimation of the wage gap in the end. So that could be useful to use a broader definition of the wage, since you can include in that some overtime bonuses, variable components, and stuff like that. So I think it would be interesting to use a different definition of wage. Then you say in your regressions that you use a fixed effect method. Do you use time fixed effect only, or do you regress a fixed effect estimator on your data? I mean that, do you do an OLS with only fixed effect dummies, only in brackets, okay, or do you use a fixed effect estimator to estimate your equations? Then you say that you decompose the wages, the wage gap between men and women in the federal workforce, and usually on this topic, to decompose a wage gap, it has only been used. It has often been used. It is the Oaxaca-Blinder method, decomposition method. I don't know if you've read about it or if you've tried it. The advantage of the method is that it gives you information about the explained part of the wage gap, as you do in your paper, but it also gives you more information about the unexplained part, which can lead to more information in the end for you, and more more stuff to say in your paper about the unexplained part. Is it linked to a specific control variable or not, etc. So if I read well, in your section 5, you have your model 10 with all your control variables. And then in section 6 and section 7, you add information about race and about pay plans. But those information about race and pay plans are not included in your model 10, I believe, in your control variable. So maybe for your section 5 to have a greater estimation of the unexplained gap, I would add those control variables in the equation. And then for section 6 and section 7, I would only analyze the interaction terms between race and women and pay plan and women. So that your wage gap of 7% might decrease a little bit by adding those information about race and about pay plan right away in your model. And then finally, maybe a last comment. You analyze the interaction terms between women and origin in race. And I would like to know, for example, are Black women more discriminated because they are women or because they are of foreign origin? And maybe this topic can be a paper as a whole, like double discrimination for a certain type of women and certain type of women according to their origin. So yes, I think that's it for my part here.
Thank you. So Teresa, I think, do you want to reply to Valentine?
Yes, I'll try to quickly hit some points. Thank you. Those were really helpful comments. I really appreciate that. So a lot of comments I thought were really helpful, and I will include, so I'll try not to, I don't have too much to say. So for my dependent variable log annual earnings, why not include a broader definition? The reason is the first thing that changes with the base pay is locality adjustments. So workers in different areas of the country receive much different pay. And so that doesn't particularly have to do with bonuses or overtime, but it will be a more conservative estimate because of I'm excluding those to begin with, but I do have that variable that includes everything else as well, adjusted basic pay. So I think it's a great idea to add that either as a robustness check or as part of it, because it is part of the pay gap, you're right. And adding more about the Oaxaca blinder. And so for the models, so we talked about the 7% unexplained gap, and you said it could be useful to add into that model the pay plan and race. And I've kind of just done it the other way, where the models, like the bar graphs I showed today by race and pay plan, have all of those other controls in it. So that kind of essentially is that, and we don't see it go much lower. Now, in terms of your question about kind of, my interpretation of your question is race or gender more prevalent for a negative impact on pay? And comparing women of different races to men in their same race and a white man showed that women receive pay impact, women of color receive a pay impact beyond their race, so that gender is a more prevalent on the pay gap. But like you said, and like I was saying, there's so much more to unpack with the dynamics of race and ethnicity. And this data set has really good race data after the first couple of years. So I'd like to do some more on that. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. So my understanding is that we will be shut down, I think, except for the co-host in 7 minutes. So open the discussion to questions. I think Aidan Ackerman had a question during your talk. Do you still? Yes.
Yes. So I think the discussant covered it in terms of defining how that income is calculated or presented. And then if you had any more background kind of on the if you looked at, I guess, the time when they were hired, right? Whether the discrimination is occurring kind of at the initial hire, or is it someone comes in and they get 10 years of experience and someone of a different gender gets 10 years of experience and then it diverges, or so I don't know if the data allow you to distinguish that, but I thought that would be interesting. And then also some of the interactions to consider in terms of occupation and experience and things like that.
Thank you. That's great feedback. And based on your name here, I imagine you on Zoom, I imagine you have some understanding of federal pay and pay variables. And I always, federal workers know what I'm talking about with adjusted basic pay, and then other people maybe not. So yeah, I appreciate that feedback. And I think that there is a lot to unravel about, is discrimination happening at the time of hiring or not? And that's where some of those administrative variables can help. It's, their, type of appointment and hiring authority. They might not mean much to those outside the federal workforce, but it's, they can help me kind of disentangle. And they didn't account for that unexplained gap. But because this is a longitudinal data set and I have the same, I have the same workers over time, over their federal careers, I can do some more investigation into that as well and get some better stories about how exactly it's happening, when it's happening in someone's career. So thank you.
Other questions? So I have a question actually, because I'm usually used to lose the workers who go and work for the federal sector. So this is awesome. So I'm wondering, again, and I think this is linked to the previous question about this transition, people who are transitioning, entering, because you discuss kind of control for experience prior to entering the federal jobs. But I was wondering, is there a lot of, are there strong gender differential in the share of men and women who transition to, who you observe as starting, kind of transitioning into your panel from outside, and kind of at what level of the hierarchy would that matter? I mean, the reason I ask, because I'm usually kind of working on, so say someone who's kind of having, proceeding over the life cycle, and at some point I lose her because she transitioned. And so I'm wondering if that's something that's more common between men and among women and among men, just so, and if that, what would be the implication of that for your result potentially? Yeah.
So what is the likelihood of transitioning in during the period?
Is there more like, is this for men, we're more likely to observe, are we more likely to see, men are career federal employers versus women are coming more likely to come from the outside? I don't know, it's just, and does this matter in terms of where they come on the pay scale, at what point they enter, and this has kind of implication for the unexplained, given that kind of the way in which the pay scale work that I have no knowledge of. So I have to, sorry if I'm
no, that's great.
Question.
I think that's a great question. Yeah. And I have a lot of similar curiosities about transitions. And so I've been thinking about how to best go about doing that kind of transition analysis, transition across agencies, within the federal government, in and out of the sample. So I think that helps me think about that. And I don't necessarily have an answer other than that the average, I have, average federal tenure years in the federal government, and that men had average 4 more years. But beyond that, I'd be interested to look at some kind of transition probabilities. Yeah.
Thank you. I just received a message that we have 1 minute remaining. So thank you all for attending this session. So I just want to put that out there. This was, a great papers and wonderful discussions. And personally, I was, I had a lot of fun and learned a lot. But Patrick Halloran had a question. Patrick, do you want to ask it? Maybe we'll make it.
No, I didn't. Sorry, I just.
Okay. Okay. Thank you so much. And we can keep talking, but I just wanted to thank you everybody for attending the session, and especially all the others and discussants for making this such an engaging experience. Thank you.
And thank you, Claudia.
Lavinia, thank you. Lavinia had a question. No. So we can keep talking though, if you want. No? Okay. So let's see. Okay, so I think we are open. So I think for the co-hosts, we can talk for another, my understanding. So but apparently not. So the session is now officially over. It's noon time, but I think we can stay. I thought they would be kicking out people who were not the co-hosts, but people who are interested in saying we can chat for a little longer. And I know I have cut off Jason.
But I have another session in 5 minutes, so I have to leave.
Okay.
But thank you very much.
Bye.
Have a nice day. Bye.
Bye. So whoever wants to stay and chat more is welcome to stay. I know Jason was answering me when I cut him off, so I don't know.
Oh, no, I was just going to thank you, Claudia. I know we cite you quite a bunch in our work, so it's nice to have you, and I really appreciate you doing this for us. I have to run to another session. My job market paper is very much related to it next seminar.
So good luck to you.
Thank you.
You and Teresa are both on the job market? Fingers? No?
A little early for me, but getting there.
I saw job market. Okay, so good luck to Jason then.
Thank you so much. It was a great conversation. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you guys so much for presenting.
Thank you.
So, thank you. And Teresa, thanks for sharing the paper on the program. And Yukiko, I don't have your paper. You see it on your webpage?
I put it in the folder of LERA, but I could send it to you. Actually,
Can you say it to me, because I don't know. I couldn't access it for some reason, so I could only access Teresa's because it was on the program. And
Claudia, Claudia, if you reach out to us, we can help you get into the box folder. There's a lot of papers put in there.
Okay, thank you so much.
I will go also. Bye. Thank you, Claudia,
for everybody.
The session, and
thank you,
Teresa, for your paper. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.